If I were learning to play chess right now, I would dream of knowing these 35 key rules that will help you win more often. The video turned out to be quite informative and at times challenging. In a short period of time, there are as many as 35 tips here, so don't hesitate to pause the video or rewind if you need to, in order to better absorb the material. Let's get started! And of course, I would start by saying that you need to control the center of the board. Be sure to move your pawns to the center to seize more space and guarantee your pieces a more advantageous position on the board. You might say, that's too simple? But I say by the time you finish watching, you'll be sitting there with your eyes wide in surprise. Let's keep going. Secondly, of course, don't neglect developing your pieces. Be sure that after you've moved out your pawns, developed your knights, and brought out your bishops, you don't get distracted by the edge of the board because that doesn't bring any benefit. The third tip I'll give you is to develop your knights first, and only then your bishops, because often we don't know which position will be best for the bishop. So bring out your knights first, and only then think about where your bishop will be most effective. The fourth and most important rule is, don't move the same piece twice in the opening without a good reason. Because if you only move one piece, first of all, you're not developing the others. Chess is a team game involving all the pieces, and by doing this, you allow your opponent to gain a huge lead in development. After dancing around with your knights at the start of the game, just look at how far ahead black is now. Let's move on. Fifth, don't bring out your queen at the beginning of the game. Absolutely not, because if you bring out your queen, you expose her to attacks and end up wasting a lot of time that you could have spent developing your pieces and only then attacking your opponent. Sixth, try to castle within the first 10 moves. Let me show you the fastest way to castle in just 4 moves. You should do it within 10 moves to avoid problems with your king getting stuck in the center of the board. After you finish developing your pieces, be sure to connect your rooks. Make sure they protect each other, help each other, and are ready to move out into the open to support your other pieces. 8th, your rooks are primarily needed to control open files. Now, with the move rook to e1, I've taken control of the open file and I'm ready to invade further. An open file is a file with no pawns on it at all. Rooks also benefit from semi-open files. These are files with only one pawn on them, either yours or your opponent's. The 9th rule is, a knight on the edge of the board is a disgrace to a chess player. Because a knight on the edge of the board controls only 4 squares, but a knight in the center of the board controls 8 squares. Just think for yourself, which is better. And remember, a knight on the edge of the board is a bad piece. The 10th and final tip is to avoid doubled pawns that are isolated from the others, because doubled pawns are a weakness. Your opponent will find it easy to attack them, and you'll be exhausted trying to defend them. In this situation, it's much better to capture with the queen to avoid problems in your own camp. The 11th thing I would advise you is to avoid pawns that are also isolated from the others. Such pawns are called isolated pawns. This means there are no other pawns on the adjacent files. White's d-pawn and a-pawn are isolated. The a-pawn is hard to attack, but the d-pawn is easy to attack. That's why isolated pawns are bad. Try to avoid having them. The 12th tip, and it's also about pawns, avoid backward pawns. A backward pawn is one that can no longer be protected by other pawns. In this pawn pair, the d4 pawn is now backward. It's just as easy to attack, and you can't defend it with another pawn, so you'll have a hard time with it too. Avoid backward pawns and don't allow them in your own camp. The 13th lucky rule, don't exchange your bishop for a knight without a good reason at the start of the game. How many times have I seen my students do this? Most of the time, you'll need your bishop later on because you don't yet know what will happen, and there's no point in exchanging it without a reason. Don't do that. 14th, don't move the central pawns that are shielding your king. Never do this because it greatly weakens your king's position, weakens the squares that your opponent's pieces can immediately seize and use to launch an attack against you. Forbidden. 15th, don't open up the center until you've finished developing your pieces and castled. Because if you start taking active measures too early, you'll pay for it since your opponent will immediately start attacking you, and with your king still in the center, you're definitely going to get punished. The 16th tip you need to know, 2 minor pieces are stronger than a rook and a pawn, and sometimes even stronger than a rook and 2 pawns, because 2 pieces that can coordinate with each other will end up being stronger than a rook. They'll be able to capture pawns and create threats against you. The 17th tip follows from the previous one. Just as 2 minor pieces are stronger than a rook, 3 minor pieces are often stronger than a queen because together they add up to 9 points. But often when the pieces work together, they create huge problems for the queen. Remember this. Next, the 18th tip. After you've occupied the open files with your rooks, invade the 7th rank. The 7th rank is the 7th row for white and the 2nd row for black. On the 7th rank, your rook can cause your opponent much bigger problems, capture pawns, and create mating threats. 19th, If you can't get your rook onto the 7th rank, double your rooks on the open file to make it possible later. The next, the 20th and a milestone rule, a bishop is better than a knight in an open position. Just look at how bishops cut across the whole board along the diagonals, while knights have no strong squares to anchor on. Also, a knight is stronger than a bishop in a closed position because bishops get blocked by pawns, while knights can jump and reach different, more advantageous squares than a bishop can. 21st, a favorite rule of Soviet chess players. When your opponent advances pawns on the flanks, respond with a strike in the center. This is to catch your opponent off guard and get to their king. 22nd. If you have a choice of which pawn to capture a piece with, move your pawns closer to the center, and conversely, don't move them away from it. The 23rd rule, knowing which you could become Mark Dvoretsky's best student. In any endgame, don't forget about your king. Be sure to activate it and bring it to the center to help your pieces. Also, don't forget to activate your pieces. But the king is an important piece in the endgame. It must be active. 24th. A rook should support its own passed pawns from behind, and it should also attack the opponent's passed pawns from behind. This is the best position for the rook. That is, ideally here, if black has a passed pawn, we should attack it with the rook from behind, and at the same time black manages to hold back our passed pawn from behind as well. If black didn't have the c-passed pawn, we would play rook to a1 and push our pawn further. The 25th rule, if the pawns have reached the 6th rank together and are connected, they become stronger than the rook. Because no matter how hard the rook tries, it can't stop them in time, and one of the pawns will definitely promote to a queen. Also, even if the rook attacks from the side, it still won't be able to stop either pawn, and one of them will definitely promote. But if, for example, it were black's move now, white wouldn't have time to promote either pawn because one of them would get stuck. If we play b6, the rook has time to capture all the pawns. 26th. If you allow your opponent to have a very strong pawn center, you must look for a way to undermine it. Here, a good move would be c5 or e5, definitely neutralize the center and try to impose your own game. Don't be a pushover. 27th. The best way to block your opponent's passed pawns is with your knight, because a knight, while blocking a passed pawn, can also continue to control important squares and, if needed, advance at the right moment. 28th tip. In a cramped position, try to exchange as many pieces as possible. Because, for example, right now it can't play, it's in our interest to trade off as many pieces as possible so that later we can bring it into play and move it to some active position. But if you don't exchange, your pieces will be very restricted and you'll get outplayed. 29th. When you have a material advantage, exchange pieces but pay close attention to pawn exchanges. This is because the fewer pawns there are on the board, the harder it will be for you to win. For example, imagine that we remove the queen and rooks from the board, leaving a rook against a knight with many pawns still on the board. The rook will simply come in and eat up all those pawns. If those pawns aren't there, black will have good chances for a draw. And conversely, the 31st tip, if you're down in material, try to exchange as many pawns as possible, but at the same time, try not to exchange pieces, otherwise you'll have a hard time in the endgame. If you end up with opposite colored bishops in the middle game, the player with the better bishop has the better position. So right now the position is tough for white. Black has a very strong bishop. The bishop goes to f4, and the queen joins the attack, after which black faces huge problems. The 32nd tip, or rather rule, is that you can sometimes try to save a pawnless endgame with opposite colored bishops, because sometimes even 2 extra pawns are not enough. Here, on the queen side, white can't break through anywhere, and they also can't advance the f-pawn onto a white square, because the dark squared bishop will never be able to help the pawn get to a white square. If you're down by a significant number of pawns, look for salvation in an endgame with opposite colored bishops. 33rd tip. Don't assume your opponent is a fool. This means you shouldn't count on them making a mistake. For example, playing for a scholar's mate in the hope that your opponent will overlook something or make a blunder is an example of this kind of play, and you should watch yourself for it. Maybe sometimes you try to play exactly like this, counting on your opponent just being an idiot. No, we should always assume that our opponent will respond in the strongest way possible, and based on that we choose our next moves respecting our opponent. 34th, always choose between several continuations. You should have candidate moves. Right now, of course, taking the rook with white would be a good move, but if you think about what other moves you can make, you'll notice that you can checkmate with the knight on d6 and win the game immediately. So never rush to make the move you want to make. Check the others first. There might be a much better move. The final 35th and most important piece of advice I can give you is, there are no rules. Did you really think that chess is such a simple game that I could tell you how to become a grandmaster just by giving you some rules? No, Among other things, a good player differs from a beginner in that they understand when it's possible to disregard the rules. They are all useful, but sometimes you need to sacrifice something and go against the rules. I hope this video was very helpful for you. Give it a like. See you next time.